So what I've been charged to look at is the nutrition improvement of food crops. And in Ray's introduction, and borrowing from Martina McLaughlin's slides, this was wave 2. Now, whatever timeline you ascribe to the bottom axis there, this wave is way late. And I'm going to try and give you some reasons why. And Ray mentioned, there were some primarily economic and fit reasons for this. This area for some of us is absolutely essential. It must succeed because we are looking at unmet needs of huge proportions. So what I'm going to talk about is the need. Why are we doing what we're doing? And I'm going to focus on micronutrient deficiencies. And let me tell you, that's a big enough problem. We're talking about 2 billion chronic sufferers in the world today, and the last year, and probably next year. Then I want to make the rationale why it's now the time to really seriously tackle these deficiencies through food and agriculture. And then I want to give you a rationale for why it makes sense for large parts of the world to attempt to tackle these problems through rice, and then lead into a couple of my favorite projects. So this is a map of micronutrient deficiencies produced by WHO. And you see the darker the color, the worse the situation. You notice these are not problems of developing worlds. I mean, if you have 4% iron deficiency anemia in the US, in many cases that's due to really bad eating habits, almost willful. But this is a problem not in the developed world. And as you know, most of the successes and early successes of GM crops came from developing countries where you had well-organized farming, your ability to capture value created. But there isn't a very good overlap between the need and the ability based on business models to carry this out. This is a huge number, I said, chronically 2 billion people, and many of these same 2 billion have 2, if not all 3 of these deficiencies at the same time or for periods each year. Just to put a face on what this means, and I just want to stress a couple of things. Vitamin A deficiency kills children. They die needlessly of measles and other infectious diseases and diarrhea because their immune system is weakened. Blindness was the early recognition, but that's not the big human cost. It is a cost, but it's not the biggest one. Zinc deficiency, diarrhea, but stunting. I would say there's really there's not a good evidence for a height gene in populations, but if you have a population with a lot of short people, you're going to look at zinc deficiency and a few others as an explanation. But in the case of iron deficiency and zinc deficiency, these are lifelong sentences. Children who do not have sufficient of these micronutrients during their development phase will have impaired physical and mental abilities. That's why when we look at these deficiencies, the World Bank can calculate percentage of GDP lost. And it is a big number. So these are huge costs on society, as well as the personal and suffering costs that people get. But also I want to point out is that the majority of these effects show up in children and women. That's based on increased needs and et cetera, through various development. Men rarely, and we won't go into some of the reasons why men don't suffer from this. So how do we, first of all, not have this problem? So I want to point first down to the bottom there, dietary diversity. Do what your mother told you. Eat a little bit of different foods every single day. You won't have this problem. Again, eat them in sufficient levels. So dietary diversity, education, and the availability of a broad range of foods means you don't have this problem. If you have the problem, the first approach is supplementation. This is a Band-Aid. So you go in and you get vitamin A supplementation growing. And in a good case, you can get in once a year, maybe twice a year. For children, you have to go in 3 times a year, and nobody has afforded that. For iron or zinc, you have to go in much more frequently, perhaps once a week or several times a week, because we don't store these nutrients. So this is quite an effort, but it does work. But it's not a solution. It's a temporary, it's a Band-Aid. Commercial fortification. So that you're all familiar with adding iodine to salt. A huge success. It removed the visible feature of goiter. but it also reduced mental retardation in children. So this is a huge successful thing, and I hate to see all this back to nature moves where people are not using iodized salt. It's nice to see in the US you've got this warning, if you take a non-iodized salt, you're actually doing damage to yourself. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but that label is huge, and it should be on many more products. But fortification, it's a food-based approach. It requires legislation, regulations, compliance, quality control, and it works for some products. But it will reach people who buy processed foods. Okay? It does not reach people who grow their own foods, source locally. So to fill the gap, there's a jargon called biofortification. We use that less and less. We talk about individual products now because we're way beyond the jargon phase. And this is breeding in all its aspects, crops for better human nutrition. And what this strives to do is fix the crops that people can afford to buy, that they can afford to grow themselves, that they can source from their neighbors. So you remove all those constraints. You also make it extremely low cost once you've developed, because it's basically supplying good quality seed or planting material. But it's not that simple. So I'm going to give you walk you through some aspects of the Harvest Plus program, but I also would be remiss if I didn't point out that Dr. Marilia Nuti here from Embrapa, who works both with Harvest Plus, but also now leads a Brazilian government effort, but also now more broadly across Latin America, to do many of the same products and types of projects that I'm going to talk about here. What I also want to point out is that this is not just funded by some of the donors I'm going to talk about in a moment, but the Brazilian government, the Chinese government, the Indian government, all fund huge efforts, or relatively large efforts, to try and to capture the value from this approach. And the value of this approach is going to increase when we have demonstrated wins. And I'm going to show you one. So this is a picture from Nigeria, and this is cassava. And so the first challenge was, if we're going to improve a crop, do we have significant or enough genetic variation in the crop to reach the targets, and I'll talk about targets later, to make this worthwhile? And in some crops, no, we cannot find enough variation. Okay? In cassava, the target here is an orange cassava, beta-carotene. There isn't a zinc project, there isn't an iron project in this particular endeavor, because there isn't significant variation in the germplasm. And I'll talk about environmental effects later. So the first thing, can you find enough variation? And then if you do, is it taken up and absorbed by the body in meaningful levels? And I can tell you that this area has done so much a contribution to bioavailability of nutrients in foods. We worked with consensus nutritionist opinions, very valid. Sometimes we've agreed, sometimes we've done much better than them. So there's a lot of new science coming out of that. So just because you increase the level, can you make a difference? And then, of course, the hard part is that you have to be able to release it in such a way that it lives on its own without your further involvement. And so this is everything from making sure the farmers accept it, consumers demand it. They understand the value, they demand it. That's so important in the success of these projects. The policymakers endorse it, that they believe in it, and they recommend it. So the example I'm going to give you comes from orange sweet potato. It used to be called orange flesh sweet potato, which doesn't sound too bad in English, but start translating that into a few other languages and it sounds a bit horrendous. So we'll just go with orange sweet potato. So this is a project that's been around probably since the mid-80s in one guise or another. Very worthwhile, but it had a lot of teething problems. So one of the first challenges that the varieties that were orange, well, sorry, first of all, in Africa, most sweet potatoes are white. The orange ones were not very popular, especially with farmers. Kids loved them because they were sweeter, they were softer, they had lower solids content. The farmers hated them because their marketable value was lower, at least at the time. So the challenge was to produce an orange sweet potato with solids and performance that farmers would accept. So going through all that in years and years, so then finally you've done your bioavailability study, you've done your bioefficacy study, which is a controlled community test where you feed people either white or orange sweet potato for a certain period of time, and does it change their vitamin A status? But then you do all your social marketing, you do your consumer awareness, you do your policy endorsements, and then you release the materials without any more artificial actions into the community, what happens? So because of years and years and years, I mean, people like Jan Lowe and others who, by the way, will always wear orange just to advertise a product, have spent our life on this. So they released the materials to 24,000 households. There was 68% adoption. There was a 40% increase in the share of sweet potato planted area. That's a dramatic increase. There was 100%, up to 100% increase in the vitamin A intakes in the diet. So this is done in 2 countries, both in Mozambique and in Uganda. And as you see, the red is the control, and then the orange is what was added into the diet. Remember, this is not a single food. This is a diet-based approach. So there were other foods contributing certain amounts of materials also. You see you got up to 100%. So this is an impact study or an effectiveness or efficacy study. So this is where we need to get. This is the first hints that we have something that's sustainable. Now, this is a worldwide problem, and I'm just going to give you, and I apologize to Marilia, her list is beyond this also. These are projects funded or managed by Harvest Plus. And cassava, the target is provitamin A. You notice no iron or zinc, okay? They're scheduled for release in Nigeria and the Congo, Democratic Congo. Beans. Beans are a hugely important peri-urban source of protein, but also for many minerals and other nutrients. So high iron beans, Rwanda and Congo. Maize, provitamin A. We call this is called orange maize. You know, there's white maize out there that has higher beta-carotene content than most yellow maize. And that was quite a revelation to understand that the yellow color comes from xanthophylls, not from carotenoids. So the work, Torbert Rocheford led this work from the beginning, worked with the IATA, and now we're looking at a launch in Zambia. And all the work has been done on bioefficacy, etc. on this. For Asia, we have pearl millet, and you know, pearl millet might sound like a minor crop to the world, but you know, for 100 million people in India, that's a pretty large population group to serve, especially in parts of India where iron deficiency anemia is endemic. Unfortunately, the large parts of India where that is a problem. So the launch here is India. I'm going to skip to wheat and then come back. I'll skip rice and come back. So wheat, the target is zinc. The targets are India and Pakistan. Again, this echoes back to the Green Revolution. So this is in a way a second revolution to now use wheat not only for food security, but now this is moving into nutrition security, especially in the area of zinc, which, as I told you, is closely associated. Lack of zinc in the diet, amongst other things, is closely associated with the duration and the repeatedness, shall we say, of diarrheal diseases. So I'm going to talk about, now I want to move to rice. So our target here is zinc, because after many years, we finally got enough variation in the germplasm to be able to actually move towards a varietal release, and the first country will be in Bangladesh. One of the things to remember is that iron and zinc have to be taken up from the soil, and the E effect can be horrendous. It took us 5 seasons in multi-locations to choose the first materials to even consider them as parents in a breeding project. So we were not only looking for accumulation, we needed to have stable accumulation that showed low E effect. That's why these projects are incredibly long. The work that led to this started in 1999 under a grant from the Asian Development Bank. So it's not an easy one, you know. 1 season results, yeah, it's interesting. Do it 3 or 4 more times, then we'll start to believe it. So the reason I've grayed out iron is that we cannot find sufficient variation in iron to reach the targets. Okay. So I'm going to spend a little time now about talking about vitamin A deficiency to reinforce why we need to do what we're doing. So this is a list of, if you asked Helen, Keller International, what are the approaches to dealing with vitamin A deficiency? Obviously, dietary diversity in the middle there is first. Large-scale food fortification. Home fortification, which is another one, which is little sachets of powders and you sprinkle onto food, etc. And that's a very intriguing way to deal with this. Nutrition education and behavior change. Promotion of optimal breastfeeding. That really means exclusive breastfeeding up to the age of 6 months. And vitamin capsule supplementation, we talked about before. But this is also a statement from Helen Keller International, and is an organization which has joined IRRI and its other partners to develop one of the products I'm going to talk about in a moment. In spite of, they participated in all those areas I showed you on the other slides, including working for the legislation, for doing monitoring programs, etc. So they still see that up to 20% of young children and women are not reached by anything they can do. Again, women and children are the most likely to be at risk and to suffer. This is why Helen, Keller International joined Golden Rice, which I'll come to in a moment, because they have exhausted their range of things that they can see. They want to look at what else should we try. They also, by the way, have the experience of working with orange sweet potato, so it's not exactly an alien idea for them to think about in this area. So where are we on the development or in the process of what the experts would say in like the complementary strategies to reduce vitamin A deficiency? So as I said, when you recognize you will probably immediately start a supplementation program if you can afford it. Now, the Philippine government for the past 15 years has buying with its own money, not donor money, supplements to distribute in the country to deal with the chronic issue of vitamin A supplementation. You go to food fortification, which it's a longer ramp-up time, okay? And these are idealized curves because they imply that one replaces the other. And then, of course, ultimately, you need to do dietary improvement, okay? So let me talk about I'm not picking on the Philippines. The Philippines is an amazing country because we have so much information, not least other things. So the supplementation program in the Philippines has been up at that high level forever, with no sign of it coming down. The food fortification curve is extremely flat. The legislation is there, but there have been incredible teething problems on developing some of the products. So let's look at dietary improvement. So why would we focus on rice? And I'm moving this back to Asia in context. So let's look at rice consumption in the Philippines. The mean weight purchased, 307 grams per person per day. Okay? That's about 850 grams of cooked rice per day. Filipinos eat rice 3 to 5 times a day. Yes, believe me. Okay? A meal isn't a meal without 2 full cups of rice on the plate. Okay? And by the way, this translates to 120 kilograms per person per year. Okay? But it doesn't matter your age range. You are eating a lot of rice throughout your life. Okay? I mean, as in many Asian countries, it isn't a meal unless rice is served. Have you had your rice today as a form of greeting in many countries? So what else does the diet look like in the Philippines? Again, this is from the National Nutrition Survey in 2008. The Philippine government has a law that every 5 years they conduct a huge survey on the health and nutritional status of its people to guide its policy and other decisions. So this is the survey this is the household survey, but I could put up children between the age of 6 months and 5 years, and there isn't much difference, unbelievably. Instant coffee is about number 5 or 6, even for children under the age of 5. Okay? But you look at 94% of the households consumed rice, and the frequency was 1.3 times per day. You see, you've got a long way down before you begin to hit, well, you've got some eggs. The bread is probably very white. Okay? May or may not be fortified now. You get down there, you get to tomato, and then you get some string beans down at the end. Okay? So this is not a very good food basket in any estimation. Okay? And as I said, I can do this for the population, or I can do it for population groups. Unfortunately, it doesn't change very much. So what does a diet overly dependent on a single starchy staple such as rice? And this is work done by Ricardo Uy and his colleagues a number of years ago, and they did it for rice, and now I'm blanking on the other crop, but they did it for 4 or 5 different staple crops, and they looked at what this means to a diet that's overly dependent on a single staple. And there's no source of vitamin A, no source of vitamin C. There's a little bit of folate. The rice estimate is actually an overestimate, we now know, and there's some zinc in the diet. Okay? So in the Philippines, let's look at what rice contributes to the recommended energy and nutrition intakes. The Philippines doesn't use an RDA, doesn't use EAR, it uses the RENI, Recommended Energy and Nutrition Intakes, and it has very detailed tables for all population groups and genders and life stages, etc. So you look at it on the household level, the contribution. So it's not surprising, it's 60% of the energy. It's pretty decent. It's got 40% of the protein. Let's see, where do I want to go? Iron. It's responsible for 32% of the iron that shows up in the diet. And I'll tell you what that looks like from the other side in a moment, okay? The one that I always love to point out is that the Filipino diet depends on rice for 20% of the calcium intake, not milk drinkers. Okay? So this is the facts. These are facts that we have this every 5 years. Unfortunately, it hasn't changed very much. So let's look at the different population groups now based on the diet alone. And by the way, this dietary survey captured fortified foods. So it's not just the regular stuff, it's also the fortified foods. So with the contribution and consumption rates, national level, only 21.5% of the population gets sufficient vitamin A from the diet. 13% of the population gets sufficient iron from the diet. Okay? Now, we've done extensive work through the Ministry of Health in Indonesia. It's pretty much the same situation, and we have also extensive work done by Harvest Plus in Bangladesh. This is a common feature, unfortunately, when you have sparse dietary diversity. The one, of course, that I find frightening is that pregnant and lactating women have less than 2% of the required iron in the diet. Okay, so this situation is pretty serious, okay? And this is in spite of all the efforts of the government. Now, when you actually measure vitamin A status and iron status, it looks better than this because of the supplement programs, etc. Okay? So, as part of it's been a long history at IRRI. As I said, it started in 1999. I didn't get there till 2003, but we have what's now called a healthier rice varieties product theme, because that's what we aim to do. We're beyond research. We're at product, and we're tackling in rice, and amongst all the Harvest Plus or other projects, we're the only crop that's taking on all three nutrients at the same time. And obviously, ultimately, we want to combine them because the same customer of ours needs all three. So we have a high beta carotene project called Golden Rice. The current level is 0. Even brown rice is close to 0, by the way. The target level is 6 to 8 parts per million. This would be estimated to be 50% of the estimated average requirement for South India, which is close to the rice consumption for the Philippines. And the estimates here, or the targets, were set by a consensus of nutritionists that met in Mexico about 6 or 7 years ago and went through all of our crops and all of our targets and said, what we know about consumption, what we know about expected bioavailability, what must you get to have a measurable success? So it's framed in terms of the estimated average requirement. And that's fine for certain audiences. I'll show you how you have that conversation with people who don't use that as the measure. Higher in rice, the level is 2. You look up food tables, it says 10 to 20. Nah, it's really easy to contaminate iron measurements. I think probably 3 years of the Asian Development Bank grant went to figure out how to measure iron accurately in foods. So it's 2, not 10. So the target is 14, and this would be estimated to give add 30% of the average requirement. High zinc rice, the current level in rice is actually 16 parts per million, but huge G by E effects. They can go from 6 to 25. We need to have it stably at 24, and that would contribute about 40% of the estimated average requirement. So you see, the targets are being set by the wisdom of people who know better than us. So what is golden rice? So golden rice is yellow. It's this beautiful color. It really is that color, at least at harvest. And it's yellow because it was through GM techniques, a gene from maize and a common soil bacterium were introduced to bolster those missing steps in the endosperm. So we went from a white endosperm to a yellow endosperm. Okay? So it's a 28-year-old idea. It's probably been feasible, really. The technical demonstration is now 13 years old. The actual practical sufficient level, the orange one there on the screen, dates from 2005. We've been working with these materials since 2006. So the current project, so it's a group of leading agricultural research organizations, which I'll come to in a moment, and nutrition organizations. Here we're talking about Helen, Keller International. This is not the product is a seed, the product is a GM product, but the product is a nutritionally enhanced food that must be delivered to the people who need it most. It has value to all, but some people need it more. So the challenge is, how do you position this and prepare it and deliver it for maximum impact where it's needed most? So what the project's involved in is making sure the varieties we're finishing meet farmers' expectations, consumers' expectations, securing biosafety approval. And if we get biosafety approval, we then move into a bioefficacy trial, which means we would ask volunteers to consume golden rice for 3 months. Control group would have white rice. What happens to vitamin A status? And then ultimately, we have to develop a program, a launch program, to make sure it gets to where it needs to be. And I'll give you some elements of that in a moment. So one of the conversations we've had to have is, agricultural organizations, gene jockeys, etc. We have to learn how to talk to people who actually need to value this project and product even more than we do. So one of the exercises, I'll take you through one, is, so we have this detailed information in the Philippines on rice consumption. And on the right we have an extract, on the right we have the rice consumption. On the left we have an extract from the recommended energy and nutrition intake table was published in 2002. And there's pretty good overlap. We can map certain groups directly one-to-one, so we can do the analysis in the next to determine the possible effect. So these are the factors we use in this particular modeling exercise. And of course, this is just an arithmetic exercise, so it can be done over and over again. But I think it's very illustrative for us, because it helps tell us some of the issues we must work on as well. So we modeled at 3 micrograms per gram, which is fairly modest. Okay, we routinely, after months of storage after harvest, we're at 8 to 9. So this is a modest modeling. Beta carotene isn't stable under storage, but I just told you that. It's also not stable depending on how you cook it. We know that rice is cooked with the lid on in steel pots or cast iron pots in the Philippines. Keeping the lid on is one of those things you do to lose less beta carotene. We put in 20%. In practically, sometimes it's about 2 to 5%, but we put in an extreme. But also, just because a food has beta carotene, how do we know it actually is converted to vitamin A? Well, we do know for golden rice. We know it for both adults and children, for work done by Tufts University and Baylor College of Medicine. So we know that in children, for every 2.3 beta carotene molecules in golden rice, we get 1 retinol molecule. For adults, it's 3.8 beta carotene to 1 retinol. These weren't done together, they're separate studies, but this is a fantastic conversion rate. Now, this is much better than the Institute of Medicine would have predicted. But what Marilla and I would tell you about is that because of Harvest Plus and others, crops like sweet potato, cassava, and maize, simple starchy substrates, have much better conversions determined in human trials than the Institute of Medicine. So we're going to use the data that have been determined for the project. So what happens when you do this analysis? And now this is modeled at 3 parts per million. And so we did it for different population groups. We had a IRRI recommendation. We knew the rice consumption. So after cooking, we would know with 20% loss how much beta carotene left. You convert that to vitamin A activity based on the conversion factors which have been determined in clinical studies. And you end up then with a contribution to the recommended energy and nutrition intake. And as you see, for children from 6 months to 12 years, at their consumption level, you're at 60% of the IRRI, and that's about 80% of the EAR. So this is a pretty good indication that even at modest levels, at that consumption level, we could have a pretty good contribution if you get 100% substitution from white rice to golden rice. So we must work on presenting this for consumption at sufficient frequency to reach these numbers for different population groups. If you remember back in the sweet potato project, they got 68% adoption. That was pretty good. And they actually have much higher levels of beta carotene as well. So this tells us, we have to work on how do we position this as Filipinos buy rice 2 to 3 times a week. That's good, because if they bought a month's supply, we'd be in serious problems of getting people to buy it for certain meals, certain times of the week, etc. So this is part of the information we have to use to drive the program. So where are we with golden rice? So since people were probably asking. So again, the leading participating organizations in the Philippines are International Rice Research Institute. Philippine Rice Research Institute will be the developer of the commercial product, i.e. the seed, and then Helen Keller International, who will look after the nutritional evaluation and developing the program specific to reaching those populations most in need, which is their bailiwick and their expertise. So we've finished our multi-location trial phase in the Philippines. This generates large parts of the data for the biosafety dossier, which we expect to submit within this year. Won't give you the exact month, but it's not that far away. If we get biosafety approval, we then go into a bioefficacy trial, which is a multi-week feeding trial in a community setting. And then what we've been doing for years, starting out with academics, with the Asian Institute of Management, then we went to consumer research firms, now we're moving on to market research firms, is we need to understand a lot about farmers' decision points, consumers' decision points, where consumers get their health information, who do they trust, not paid endorsers, that's good, so we won't be wasting money on those, and key influencers, whose opinion, but also their role in the whole process, we must understand. And we must, part of guiding the development plan is what information do they need to know to be able to make a decision. So, you know, an example is the Philippines, the Catholic clergy they get involved in everything. And there's a certain polarization. There's a pro-GM bishops group and an anti-GM bishop group. So we've conducted surveys with the clergy and we've asked them, you know, what do you think of golden rice? It's generally positive. But what are your issues? Well, they worry about corporate control and equity for the farmers to be able to save seed. Not an issue, they're not part of it. So that helps us stress in conversations with the clergy that that's the area they have concern, that's the area we better tell them up front, etc. So this is a long process. This, you know, getting the biosafety approval is going to be the easiest part of this process, or one of the easier parts. But I want to end with my new favorite project, okay? So as I said, ultimately we want to be able to deliver all 3 micronutrients, a rice plant with improved micronutrients, all 3 micronutrients in the grain. So as I said, I've talked to you about the zinc project, which is scheduled for launch in Bangladesh. We've reached the target. It takes years to select materials, etc. But we started out in a project to try and deal with the iron problem. We could never get above 6 to 7 parts per million iron. On a good day, we got to 8. Our target was 14. So we've worked with the University of Melbourne and the University of Tokyo primarily, and taking their leads, we've now been able to produce a GM plant. This is IRRI 64. You heard how wonderful it is from Wayne earlier. A mega variety in Asia, where we've now using a rice gene, a cochianamin synthase, which produces a chelator, which the plants use to move ions around in the plant. It also produces the products, leads to the phytophosphorus that the plant sends out and then brings back in to recover these metals. And the ferritin gene from soybean, which we know from work done by Bo Lannerdahl has the same bioavailability as ferrous sulfate, et cetera, et cetera. So with these 2 genes, now we've hit the iron target in a field trial, and we've actually hit a new target for zinc. But the other important thing is here, we've committed to 5 field trials before we declare success here, because we must make sure there's no effect on the plants, but also we have evidence that there is no environment effect with the GM approach. That's because these are the numbers we got in successive screenhouse trials before we went into the field. Now, that's grounds for confidence, but we're conducting trials on 2 continents, in Colombia and in the Philippines before we declare success here. Again, this work is led by my great friend and colleague, Ines Ahmedludin. So, we've committed to a food-based approach. We're actually structured into much more product thinking in this area, and we have definitions of when things become a product. And our commitment is to work with the right partners to make this a success, as are all of our partners committed to make this a success, but based on science. So if we don't get biosafety approval, this stops. If we don't show bioefficacy, this doesn't go ahead. So these are conditionalities. And then we have to develop the program for successful adoption. So just on financial support, since I presented some results, so the Golden Rice Project is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and in the Philippines by the Department of Agriculture of the Philippines. In Bangladesh, the Ministry of Agriculture. In Indonesia, the Ministry of Agriculture funds the work there also. The high iron work was funded by U.S. Agency for International Development and by Harvest Plus. I'm going to thank you for your attention. If you want to get the real stories about golden rice, please go to this website. We're just below Wiki now, okay? So we've improved our visibility. And we do contribute to Wiki also. And then to look at the whole range of projects under Harvest Plus, there's their website. Thank you very much.